What happened when Coca-Cola abruptly shut down one of its California factories, and why did the governor's reaction make national headlines? From heated press conferences to stunned employees left in uncertainty, the fallout exposed more than just a factory closure. Stay with us because the governor's response will leave you speechless. The sudden shutdown. The announcement came without ceremony and with little warning. On a quiet Friday, Reyes Coca-Cola Bottling confirmed it would consolidate operations, effectively shutting down a long-standing facility in California. By Monday morning, the gates were still standing, the branding unchanged, but the certainty that once defined the site was gone. For the workers who reported there each day, the future narrowed suddenly, reduced to unanswered questions and tentative reassurances. Local officials struggled to contain the uncertainty. Public statements emphasized that only a limited number of jobs would be affected. Yet the timeline told a different story. In previous months, similar facilities had closed just as abruptly, leaving hundreds unemployed overnight. This was not the first time the beverage giant's restructuring had collided with California's manufacturing workforce, and the pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. At first glance, the shutdown appeared to be a routine business consolidation. Corporations adjust, streamline, and relocate as markets evolve. But this decision landed in a state already grappling with a steady drumbeat of factory closures, particularly in food and beverage manufacturing. The context mattered. California had long marketed itself as both an innovation hub and an industrial powerhouse, yet here was another example of a legacy brand stepping back from physical production within the state. Behind the official language of efficiency and optimization lay a deeper unease. Workers were advised to seek other opportunities. Communities were told the impact would be limited. Yet history suggested otherwise. When plants close, secondary effects ripple outward, touching suppliers, small businesses, and local tax bases. What was framed as a modest adjustment carried consequences that extended far beyond the factory floor. The timing raised further questions. Energy costs were climbing. Regulatory compliance was growing more complex. At the same time, multinational corporations were openly shifting toward leaner operational models, reducing their ownership of physical infrastructure. The shutdown fit neatly into that broader transformation, but it also exposed a fault line between corporate strategy and regional stability. For state leaders, the closure presented an uncomfortable moment. California's economic narrative emphasizes resilience and attraction, pointing to continued growth in technology and biotech sectors. Yet manufacturing tells a different story, one measured not in valuations but in lost shifts and shuttered buildings. The governor's office offered no dramatic response, choosing instead to reaffirm long-standing strengths. That restraint left room for critics to shape the conversation. As news of the shutdown spread, it became a symbol. To some, it was evidence of a hostile business climate. To others, it was an unavoidable outcome of global restructuring. The truth, as always, sat somewhere between those positions. What mattered most in that moment was not ideology, but immediacy. Jobs were ending, communities were bracing, and a familiar name was quietly stepping back from a place it once called home. This was how the story began. Not with outrage or spectacle, but with a simple announcement that revealed how fragile certainty had become in an economy built on constant change. Searching for the real reasons. With the initial shock absorbed, attention shifted to the explanations offered for the shutdown. Corporate statements pointed to consolidation, efficiency, and alignment with long-term strategy. On paper, the reasoning appeared straightforward. The company emphasized the need to streamline operations and better position itself in a changing market. Yet, these carefully chosen words raised as many questions as they answered. To understand the decision, it was necessary to step beyond press releases and examine the data shaping the business environment. Energy costs in California had climbed steadily, placing manufacturers at a disadvantage compared to states with lower utility rates. Compliance requirements had expanded, adding layers of cost and administrative burden that disproportionately affect large-scale production facilities. None of these pressures were new, but together they formed a backdrop that made physical manufacturing increasingly expensive. At the same time, Coca-Cola was undergoing a global transformation. Financial reports showed a deliberate shift away from owning and operating bottling plants toward a model that emphasized branding, marketing, and product development. Bottling and distribution were increasingly outsourced to third-party partners, reducing capital risk and allowing faster adaptation to consumer trends. From a balance sheet perspective, the logic was compelling. Operating margins improved. Cash flow strengthened. Flexibility increased. What remained unclear was how much California-specific factors influenced the decision versus broader corporate restructuring. Public policy reports complicated the narrative. While headlines often suggested a mass corporate departure, the data showed that California's rate of company exits largely matched national averages. Many firms continued to arrive, particularly in high-growth sectors. This contrast challenged the idea that the shutdown could be explained solely by a hostile business climate. Still, manufacturing told a more vulnerable story. The sector's share of the state's economic output had declined over more than a decade, reflecting automation, global competition, and rising domestic costs. Food and beverage plants were especially exposed, operating on thin margins and facing constant pressure to modernize. In that context, even a profitable facility could become expendable if it no longer fits a streamlined corporate vision. The lack of transparency added to the tension. Workers and local leaders were given limited insight into how the decision was made or whether alternatives had been considered. Was investment in modernization ever on the table? Were incentives discussed? Or was the outcome decided long before the announcement was made public? These questions lingered, unanswered but persistent. By comparing official explanations with economic indicators and corporate strategy, a more complex picture emerged. The shutdown was neither an isolated failure nor an inevitable collapse. It was the result of intersecting forces, some global, some local, all reshaping how companies define efficiency and responsibility. As the search for reasons continued, one conclusion became harder to avoid. The story was not about a single plant or a single policy. It was about how modern corporations weigh place against profit and what is left behind when those calculations no longer align. A pattern, not an exception. As attention widened beyond a single facility, the shutdown began to resemble part of a larger pattern rather than a standalone event. Across California, manufacturing sites had been quietly scaling back, consolidating or closing altogether. Individually, each decision came with its own explanation. Taken together, they formed a trend that was difficult to ignore. Public data revealed a steady erosion in the state's manufacturing footprint. Over the past decade, the sector's contribution to California's overall economic output had declined, even as the broader economy expanded. Automation accounted for some of the change, allowing companies to produce more with fewer workers. Global competition played its role as well, pushing firms to seek lower-cost production environments. But these forces alone did not explain why closures were clustering in specific industries and regions. Food and beverage manufacturing stood out. These plants depend heavily on energy, transportation, and regulatory compliance, all of which have become more expensive. Unlike technology firms, they could not easily offset rising costs with rapid innovation or high margins. For them, even incremental increases in operating expenses could tip long-term calculations. When corporate leaders reviewed portfolios of facilities, California plants increasingly appeared vulnerable. Yet the broader narrative surrounding corporate departures often overstated the scale of the exodus. Policy institutes and economic researchers cautioned against drawing sweeping conclusions from high-profile closures. Their findings showed that while some companies left, others arrived. Headquarters moved out, but new ones moved in. The churn, statistically, aligned closely with national norms. The contradiction between perception and data complicated public understanding. This tension fueled debate. Critics pointed to each shutdown as proof of systemic failure, citing taxes, regulation, and cost of living as decisive factors. Supporters countered with figures highlighting California's continued dominance in innovation, venture capital, and job creation. Both sides drew from selective evidence, reinforcing opposing narratives that rarely intersected. What often went missing was the distinction between sectors. California's strength in technology and biotech masked weakness in traditional manufacturing, Growth in one area did not automatically compensate for losses in another, especially in communities built around industrial employment. When a factory closed, the impact was concentrated and immediate, regardless of broader economic health. Geography amplified these effects. In smaller cities and towns, a single plant could anchor the local economy. Its closure disrupted not just employment, but identity. Skilled workers faced limited alternatives. Local governments confronted shrinking tax bases. These consequences unfolded quietly, far from the headlines celebrating startup growth in coastal hubs. The Coca-Cola shutdown fit squarely within this landscape. It was not the largest closure, nor the most dramatic, but it echoed others before it, reinforcing the sense that manufacturing in California was increasingly provisional, tolerated rather than cultivated. Each decision, justified on its own terms, contributed incrementally to a larger shift. Seen this way, the story became less about blame and more about trajectory. The question was no longer why one company left, but whether the conditions existed for manufacturers to stay. As patterns replaced anecdotes, the debate moved from isolated incidents toward a reckoning with structural change that was already well underway. Politics, power, and silence. As the economic implications became clearer, the political response drew increased scrutiny. In moments of industrial loss, public leadership often sets the tone for how events are interpreted and remembered. In this case, the reaction from state leadership was measured, restrained, and notably quiet. There were no emergency press conferences, no direct confrontations with corporate executives, and no public reassurances tailored to the affected communities. Instead, official messaging remained consistent with long-standing themes. California's economic scale, its skilled workforce, and its dominance in innovation were emphasized. The shutdown was not addressed directly, folded instead into broader narratives of resilience and growth. For supporters, this approach reflected confidence. For critics, it appeared disconnected from the immediate reality on the ground. Silence, however, rarely remains empty. In the absence of a forceful response, others filled the space. Business groups framed the closure as a confirmation of long-warned consequences, pointing to taxes, energy costs, and regulatory complexity. Opinion columns and broadcast segments amplified the argument, treating the shutdown as symbolic rather than situational. The story spread quickly, shaped less by official statements than by interpretation. Lawmakers entered the debate from predictable angles. Some called for regulatory reform and tax relief, arguing that manufacturing could not compete under current conditions. Others urged caution, citing data that showed California continuing to attract investment in high-value sectors. The discussion unfolded along familiar lines, but the closure gave it renewed urgency and a tangible reference point. What remained largely unexamined was the strategic silence itself. By avoiding direct engagement, state leadership minimized the risk of escalating conflict with a global brand. At the same time, that restraint allowed critics to define the narrative unchallenged. The choice reflected a calculation about optics and priorities, one that favored long-term positioning over short-term confrontation. Media coverage further complicated the picture. Headlines often blurred distinctions between corporate restructuring and political accountability. Complex decisions were compressed into simple cause and effect arguments. Viewers and readers were left to navigate competing claims, with little clarity about how much influence policy truly exerted over corporate strategy. The shutdown also intersected with other high-profile business stories, reinforcing a sense of momentum. Reports of companies relocating offices or opening facilities in other states were frequently linked, regardless of context. Individual decisions were grouped into a broader storyline about decline and departure, even when the facts differed significantly. For affected workers and communities, these political debates offered limited comfort. Discussions about competitiveness and innovation did not address the immediate loss of stability. The distance between policy discourse and lived experience widened, highlighting a recurring challenge in economic governance. In the end, the political response revealed as much through absence as action. The lack of direct acknowledgement did not prevent the shutdown from becoming a rallying point. Instead, it underscored how power can be exercised quietly, shaping outcomes not through confrontation, but through selective attention and deliberate restraint. The cost beyond the balance sheet. When the machinery stopped and schedules ended, the true cost of the shutdown could not be measured in earnings or margins. For workers, it was a sudden rupture, erasing years of experience and local loyalty, forcing them into a labor market with no guarantees. In manufacturing communities, employment shapes identity, routines, and long-term planning. A single plant sustains networks of suppliers, retailers, and services, so its closure ripples far beyond the payroll. Households unconnected to the plant still feel the impact. Local governments face declining taxes, strained services, and urgent revisions to economic strategies. Replacing such an employer is rarely simple. Service jobs often lack comparable wages or benefits, while high-tech positions are unevenly distributed and require skills the local workforce may not have. The consequences unfold slowly, reshaping community stability in profound ways. At the state level, these closures challenge a central assumption of economic transition. Growth in innovation and technology is often presented as a universal offset, capable of absorbing displaced workers and revitalizing regions. In practice, that transition is uneven and slow. Workers trained for industrial roles cannot easily migrate into specialized fields without time, support, and opportunity. The gap between promise and reality becomes more visible with each closure. There is also an intangible cost, one tied to perception and trust. When established brands reduce their physical presence, confidence erodes. Communities question whether long-term investment is still possible. Younger generations reassess their prospects. The sense that stability can vanish without warning reshapes how people relate to employers, institutions, and policy. From a corporate perspective, the decision may appear rational, even necessary. Leaner operations, flexible partnerships, and optimized capital allocation align with modern market demands. Yet these efficiencies externalize risk, shifting uncertainty away from balance sheets and onto workers and towns. What is gained in agility is often lost in continuity. The shutdown also invites a broader question about economic identity. California has long defined itself through reinvention, balancing industry, innovation, and culture. As manufacturing recedes, the state must confront what replaces not just the jobs, but the role those jobs played in regional life. The answer remains unresolved. In the end, the cost of the shutdown cannot be fully tallied. It exists in spreadsheets and reports, but also in quieter places, in altered commutes, postponed plans, and a growing awareness that even the most familiar institutions are subject to abrupt change. The balance sheet may close cleanly, but the story does not end there. Were you shocked by how the California governor reacted to Coca-Cola's sudden factory shutdown and the ripple effects on workers and communities? Share with us which part of the story surprised you the most.